Hey folks, this is episode 44 of Long Shots, our weekly podcast where we discuss all things business and finance. And this is Nikhil Arora. I have with me Sharad Tupran. Hello Sharad, how's it going?
It's very good. I've used the same line every time, but it's no different. I'm looking forward again to today's chat. It's a topic that I have absolutely no idea about. Well, just a little bit, but lots to learn today.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. This is, again, we are kind of doing a slight gear shift from the series of guests that we are having in season 3. It's been quite an exciting ride. And before I get into our special guest today, quick reminder to all our listeners, do subscribe to our channel, search for Long Shots. We are streaming on iTunes, Deezer, Spotify, and many other eclectic. That's the word, sir, because
It's back.
The word eclectic is back again to describe the mix of podcast apps that we are on. So do feel free to subscribe so that you get that nice notification every time an episode goes live. This scripted part is now all done, and we'll now kick off with Aneesh Jain. Aneesh is a good friend of mine. He was with me in IIT Kharagpur. Following that, he's a computer engineer by training, but I think that ship sailed quite some time back, right? And after that, he dabbled in consulting, social entrepreneurship, and he now runs a venture in the agri-tech space. Welcome, Anish.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you,
Sharad. Yes,
That is an eclectic mix.
that is again an eclectic way of putting it, but no, thanks a lot for finding the time, and we'll pretty much like to start from the start because you are currently how long has it been since you started Gram Unnati?
It's been almost 6.5 years for us now.
Right.
We started in the early part of 2013, and it's been an interesting ride coming to this place. I think we're just happy that we've survived the last 6.5 years more than anything else.
How positive.
Yeah.
And in terms of what is Gram Unnati, we'll kind of go to that in a minute. But agriculture in India, looking at marginal farmers, looking at banking institutions in the heartland of the country, it sounds challenging as we even talk about it. So what really compelled you to seriously, dabble in this space? Not just dabble, actually, you're in it. You've been in it for now so many years. There must have been a very obvious pain point that you saw, which kind of pushed you to consider it as a business proposition. So how did it all start? I know that you worked on the agri sector as a consultant.
Yeah.
And I guess that project has some sort of an extrapolation into your present venture, but that's now again 6 years old.
Yeah. That actually almost happened 10 years back.
Right.
So there was quite a while before we could figure out what we wanted to do and kind of get things in place. It all started when post my consulting days, I had taken a break just to spend some time in the development sector. And it took me to the villages of Rajasthan to work with soybean and mustard farmers and see what issues they were facing in terms of ensuring that they can improve the productivity of their produce. And we spent almost 1.5 years with those farmers, worked with 2,000 farmers. And the interesting finding was that yes, there's not been any over the years, the systemic support which is extended to farmers from neutral institutions, which is predominantly the agriculture department, other agencies, has gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be because of various factors. The influx of input companies and other people with vested interests has kind of really now influenced where farmers or how farmers are cultivating their crops. So if you can kind of correct some of those wrongs and ensure that farmers have access to the right set of advisory services and the right set of inputs, you can do a lot of work around improving their productivity. And that was the work which we had done back in the day. What we realized, or the interesting finding, was that our hypothesis back in the day was that if you improve farmers' productivity, more produce will basically lead to more revenues and hence higher income.
Sure.
What we found interestingly was that that does not necessarily translate, because the price of the end commodity is pretty much driven by what the market is, and overproduction generally leads to a drop in prices.
Right.
So our work back in the day led to, I think, maybe a 8 to 10% increase in productivity. And while we would like to take credit for it, it could could just have been weather factors or other conditions. But it also brought about a drop in prices by around 8 to 10%.
Right.
So effectively, the farmers were where they were in terms of income in their pocket, and which is what led to us trying to figure out where the issues were in the entire ecosystem, and is pretty much how Gram Unnati was born in trying to solve those problems. When we started it, intuitively it looked like a brilliant idea because everyone who would be a part of the system would benefit. It's been a tough ride over the last 6.5 years.
Walk us through the idea. So what is like? How does it solve the productivity problem? Let's say from a
So the problem which we encountered at that point of time was these farmers started producing more. They are then supposed to sell in localized markets.
Correct.
So you can't really expect farmers to bring their produce all the way to a Delhi. So for a farmer, it's unproductive for them to move their produce over 500, 700,000 kilometers. So they would generally just go sell it in in what is called as a market yard or a mandi or a APMC yard or the like. So there are different names given to that outlet. It's supposed to be a neutral auction platform where farmers and traders will meet. Farmers will bring in their produce, traders will bid for it. Whoever is the highest bidder kind of gets to carry the produce back, and they will pay the farmer on the spot. Sadly though, it's heavily biased in favor of the traders because if the farmer, so there are way too many farmers while there are a very limited number of traders.
It's a supply demand thing then.
More than that, right? So the traders are also there who are there every day, right?
Okay.
So the farmers will come in once your produce gets harvested. So there is very little cohesion between the farmers. But the traders are there day in and day out. They are pretty much dealing with the same set of buyers. So they actually get to decide at what rate they want to buy. In some cases, and we've been kind of over the years come across really interesting stories where it is almost impossible for an outside neutral agency to be a part of that system because the entire system requires a letter of recommendation from one or two of these existing guys. So if only you know one of these guys will actually is when you'll get an entry into the system.
So it's ring-fenced like that.
Yeah. So it's basically, I don't want to go to the extent of calling it that they are all colluding, but they could very well be. So if this tiny group decides that today we are going to buy at this rate, or basically we are going to kind of fleece the farmer and make a killing in terms of supplying to whoever you want to do, they could very easily do that. And that's where the entire system starts getting biased, right? So what was supposed to be a neutral auction platform now becomes a platform which is heavily in favor of the buyer. It's the buyer who's deciding the prices. The farmer has an option to reject that sale, but then it's counterproductive, right? So if the farmer says that I'm not going to sell your produce today, I'm expected to then carry this produce all the way back to my home, come again another day with no guarantee that the next day the prices are going to improve. So the entire issue was in terms of there was no transparency in how pricing was decided. This was a very lovely dialogue which a farmer had actually once said to us. When we asked him, how do you sell or in a mandi, or how do you decide the price? The farmer who was in Rajasthan said, mandi mein maal nahi bikta hai, insaan bikta hai. So it is not the quality of your produce, but it is your standing in the society or your ability to actually negotiate with the buyer and your ability to withhold your sale. Is basically what decides what price you get.
But that sounds like a localization problem, is it? I mean, in terms of I guess that it can be totally buyer driven if there is constant oversupply, but in this case that oversupply is probably structural because it's localized in the sense that if suppose tomorrow the price point is not right, why can't a farmer from some other locality fill in the gap?
In what sense?
In the sense that if you're looking at if the traders are driving the price action, how come the entire balance of power is always in their side of the equation?
So we've got over 100 crore farmers.
Okay.
We've got maybe a few thousand, maybe a few lakh traders who are operating. So it is, and every farmer is obviously is busy with a lot of other things, right? So farmers, so you also got to look at a farmer as an individual who's trying to do multiple things. He's typically an entrepreneur, right? So it's an entrepreneur who starts a new business every season. So before the start of a season, the farmer has to decide what crop do I sow. It's pretty much based on assumption or on faith at times that okay, if I sow soybean or if I sow maize or if I sow wheat, I will get a better return. There is absolutely no guarantee that I'll get those prices once the harvest comes in. He has to or she has to take a call in terms of what inputs go in. They have to obviously do the operations on the field. They are supposed to look at how do I arrange financing to kind of run this tiny enterprise of mine. And then finally, when the produce comes in, they're also supposed to be salespersons. So it's just too many roles rolled into one.
And it's a very heavily intermediated sales channel, right?
Yeah,
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have like 30 options, right, to go to.
So it's not right. So I'm a resource poor guy. I will go to whichever is the most convenient way of sale,
Right.
because the moment I sell off this produce, I have to then start cultivating the next round of crops, right?
Right.
So I have only got a limited window where I need this money in my pocket quickly so that I can buy imports, start cultivating again, and hope that everything goes right in the next cycle. So it's got to look at convenience. It's not got to look at my ability to hold my produce, because I've got absolutely no other sources of income, or
Right.
I've got very limited savings, or generally most of these people are in debt, and
I guess these are some of the areas that you are trying to cater to via Gram Unnati, right?
Yeah, so we basically started looking at what the issue was, and then the other end of the spectrum, the agro-processors were also being taken for a ride by this group of traders, right? So tomorrow these group of traders can actually stock their produce and quote whatever price they wanted.
Right.
So while there are still a few of them, and there will be some guy who might be able to, who might not fall in line with a common decision which has been taken, but these agro-processors still had to pretty much depend on this lobby to supply to them. While unfortunately, if you look at the entire spectrum, it's generally the farmers and the agro-processors who are playing the most important role in this entire ecosystem. So what we do is we figured out that in this entire supply chain, there are a bunch of people who are facing an issue, predominantly the agro-processors and the farmers. And can you create a system which works fairly, creates an ethical, transparent system where the farmer and the buyer can engage? Which in terms was, if the farmer could be told in a very transparent way that this is today's price, this is how we do the quality check, this is your quality, your price gets decided, you either get a premium or a discount, and you do the aggregation at this level and you move the produce transparently, right? It was a very simple idea to begin with, and we thought that everyone was a winner.
So like when you're looking at like agro-processing, you're looking at big institutional buyers, right?
So we typically work with large institutional buyers, but then if you look at even the smallest
if you have to break it down, like if you have a large institutional buyer and if you have a small marginal farmer, what all are the steps in between both these counterparties at the moment?
Okay.
Maybe when you started.
Yeah. I think it's maybe only become worse over time, because landholdings have become even more smaller as the last 6 years have passed by.
Right.
Generally what happens is there would be some level of aggregation. So if you're a really small farmer, there will be some level of aggregation which happens at the village level itself.
Okay. Sure.
So you will have someone who is a more powerful or a bigger farmer who would then buy off the produce from the smaller farmers.
Right.
That becomes the first level of aggregation.
Right.
Who will then move it to typical mandi, which would be, let's say, 20-30 kilometers away. There would be a trader, and this is what happens in Rajasthan.
So a typical mandi would be covering a lot of villages, multiple districts. Is that how it typically works?
So generally mandis are active at a subdivision level, a sub-district level.
Okay.
So every district would have, let's say, 4 to 6, maybe 8 active mandis.
Right.
There might be some of those which might be bigger. So for example, a Kota mandi or a Ganganagar mandi are huge, while other mandis in Kota district might be smaller.
Right.
But in a different district, all of those mandis might have almost the same scale.
Right.
It just depends on the volume of business which mandi can cater to. So the first level of aggregation happens at the village level. There is some margin which gets built into that for the aggregator. This aggregator would move it to generally a mandi which is closer. So maybe a mandi which is 20 to 30 kilometers away from where they are. It would be bought by a trader. In states like Rajasthan, you have 2 layers of traders. So you have a farmer's representative called a Kacha Arthiya, and you have a buyer's representative called a Pakka Arthiya.
Right.
And the Kacha Arthiya is supposed to be a farmer's representative who's going to kind of do the auction on behalf of the farmer.
Right.
And who makes sure that the farmer gets paid immediately. While the Pakka Arthiya will pay the Kacha Arthiya over let's say a 7-day or a 15-day credit period, whatever is decided mutually between them.
And they both take a commission cut.
Obviously. There are no free lunches.
Yeah.
So the
it's
first
typical market making.
It's market making. Yeah, exactly.
So they will take that. This trader, the Pakka Arthiya, might know one of these big buyers directly, which in case happens in the case of, let's say, a big mandi like Kota, because the volumes you're dealing with are huge. But in a smaller area, this guy would then be working with a bigger trader or a broker to actually supply to one of these larger buyers.
Right.
So you generally have 3 or 4 layers of middlemen.
Right.
You also have multiple transits, right? So the smaller farmer would move it to a bigger farmer. The bigger farmer would move it to the first mandi. From there, it might move to a broker's place or a bigger trader's place, and from there it gets transported to to an actual processor, right? So it's not just the number of middlemen or the number of stakeholders, it's also the inefficiencies which get built into the thing.
Right.
And there is no loyalty or there is no transparency between each of those transactions.
Yeah.
So the bigger buyer, the farmer will not, the bigger farmer will not tell the smaller farmer what rate. The traders will obviously not. They will try to kind of compete with each other. And obviously this loyalty or this mistrust kind of gets extended up to the buyer's level, because the buyer also doesn't trust the supplier, right? Because all of this produce gets moved in gunny bags. You can do a quality check, but then you can never be absolutely 100% sure of what is the quality you're getting. Yeah. So there are ways and means in which you can kind of actually move inferior grade quality to a buyer and get paid for a higher grade quality. So there is a lot of mistrust which exists in the entire system.
And the consequence being that the institutional buyer is paying too much and the farmer is not getting much.
So the consequence also being that you build in that risk factor, right? Yeah. Because you don't know if I'm going to get grade A or grade B, even though I'm paying for grade A. So I will automatically lower my price of grade A so that even in the case I get cheated, my bottom line doesn't get hit. Right. And then that gets transferred across as in down the system. So if you could just create a very neutral, transparent, open system where everyone knew what was the grade of or what was the quality, and there was complete assurance that there was a buyer who's going to be seated at the back of all of this with assurance of payments, you can actually correct a lot of the wrongs.
And piss off a lot of people as well.
Whenever each of these guys are actually engaging, they do take some element of risk. So if you de-risk the entire supply chain, you lower their risk exposure while the returns go down, but you lower their exposure. What we do actually ends up doing that, right? So what we do is we end up removing these different layers of middlemen, and we try to create these channels directly between smallholder farmers and these large institutional buyers, with we being the only aggregator. Right. And with also bringing in efficiencies in terms of the movement, the number of times the movement of these goods gets reduced. Right. And all of those efficiencies then start adding up as benefits which get accrued to the farmer as well as to the buyer. Right. So in that process, yes, you do end up rubbing a lot of people the wrong way, but if you look at the numbers, right, our reach is still very limited. There are still a lot of farmers who have to engage with these people, because these middlemen, the kacha arthiyas or the pakka arthiyas, or these large farmers who are aggregating at a village level also double up as money lenders at times. So there is a financing play. Yeah, so there is a financing play. There is a sense of forced loyalty which is built to the system, because this farmer has to sell to the guy who he or she is taken a loan from. Right. So that will continue to be till the time we can actually ensure that every farmer's got access to institutional credit lines which are maybe secured by whichever assets. And that's the issue, right? So each of these individuals, when they give out loans, are actually giving out unsecured loans. Yeah. So you can't really even blame them for trying to take a pound of the flesh in this process.
Because I remember, way back when you had started, and when I used to ask you exactly how does this entire value chain work, I remember you used to tell me that, I'm buying them time. Right? You used to tell that at the end of the day, at this scale, there is an urgent obligation to dump your produce so that you go on to the next year. You have the inputs, the financing ready, and then you kind of play it by that. And that's why you kind of miss on the actual value premium that you might be able to extract for the market. So I'm kind of coming in between and basically buying time, and by buying time also enabling the transaction to happen at the right price between the final buyer and the initial supplier. Yeah. How far is that still the mission or the vision driving Gram Unnati, or as all ventures pivot through the years, is that still the principle behind it, or things have changed?
So when we started off, the objective was to kind of create a platform where these buyers could source directly from smallholder farmers. Right. And in the process also bring in some value. So work with an institutional warehousing provider, work with a bank which can bring in financial products to support this entire supply chain, which meant basically that if farmers did not want to sell their produce immediately right after harvest, and you are forced to do that because you need money immediately, you don't have access to warehousing, you can actually store it in a warehouse,
Yeah.
wait till you kind of get the right price and then sell it forward. So we've done that work, and we do
You have facilitated the warehouse. You
so
have
we
facilitated the lending.
yeah, so we've done this. So we've not just facilitated the warehousing or the lending, we also ensure that there is a market at the end of it.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Because the other issue is that if it were just a farmer and a warehouse and a financial institution, the farmer can keep his or her produce in the warehouse,
Yeah.
get a loan against it, and wait till the price becomes favorable, right? If the price becomes favorable after 3 months, you've actually already used all the money because your produce which is kept in the warehouse is now marked to the bank. For you to actually repay the loan, you need to be able to sell the produce before you can repay the loan. And
Yeah.
sadly, because this produce is marked to the bank, you can't really take out the
Take it
produce,
out.
right?
Yeah.
So you are stuck between like basically the deep blue sea and the devil.
Right.
Because or a Catch-22 kind of a situation, because you can't really move forward. So
Yeah.
when you introduce a buyer and you bring in transparency into the entire system, where the buyer has complete knowledge about what is the grade which is stored, what is the quantity which is stored, where is it stored, who is the farmer, they can actually make a price commitment and to make an advance payment to the bank to pay off the loan and they make sure that this transaction
That
happens.
endpoint is very essential.
Yeah, so we kind of create that end-to-end system where you bring in these different stakeholders and manage it. Over the years, so this is what we started off with. We still offer it as a service, but what has happened is there are two things which have happened. When we started this, the hypothesis or the going idea was that the prices would be very low around the time of harvest because there would be a lot of distress sale which happens.
Right.
Everyone's trying to sell it off at that point of time.
Right.
And which we had seen in the past. After 3 to 4 months, the prices start rising up by as much as 30% in some cases. So this was one thing which happened. The other was we thought that the buyers would also want to have access to an assured inventory, right? So this is almost assured inventory for them, where you know what is the grade of produce where it is stored, which you know that will come to you at some point of time. Sadly, what happened was somehow the markets now are not really behaving the way they should be. So as in, and maybe it is because we've now become a part of a very large global integrated supply chain where a buyer can source from not just India, but you can kind of import shiploads of corn from a US or oil from some other part, right? So your dependency on just local supplies is limited.
Right.
There are also supply buffers which have been built over the years. So there is now a lot of there are not allowed now a lot of warehouses which have old stock which is kept over there. And the third is over time what we realized is that while this price premium, part of it was distress sale, part of it was also the fact that when the produce comes in, it maybe got more moisture, maybe the quality is slightly inferior, and over time as it dries out, the kind of returns start, as in the volume starts going down, but the price starts increasing.
Okay.
So your net income, which is basically quantity into price, is almost in line with what your carrying cost was.
Right.
So while there is an incentive for a farmer or any group to be engaged in stocking their produce, there is an element of risk. It could not rise up in line with what your carrying cost is also. And there is obviously a higher margin, as in the carrying cost is not just the cost of interest plus warehousing. There is also a loss of material which happens over time.
Sure.
Yeah. So those are reasons. So while we still offer it as a service, and not a lot of buyers are keen to make those commitments because they are more than happy to get supplies from an outside source or buy whenever they get it. So what now we realize is, while this value is not there, but every agro-processor, and we typically work with agro-processors, has a specific requirement in terms of quality and variety. And maize is a classic example of that. So maize as a product can be used for multiple purposes. It can go into chicken feed, it can go into cattle feed. You can have different kinds of starch coming out of it, pharma, baby food, industrial. It can also be used for human consumption.
Right.
Every one of these guys has got a different requirement. Right? So the chicken feed guy wants maybe higher protein and a brighter colored crop, while a pharmaceutical guy wants no residue or a very specific kind of starch. As you start understanding their requirements and you start kind of working with a larger set of players to ensure that production systems are actually aligned, is where you really unlock value.
Right. Yeah.
So if you can help a buyer unlock, let's say 5% value by getting them the right kind of starch or the right color of maize, you actually, as in their efficiencies rise up, and they are happy to share some of that downstream.
Right.
which is a more sustainable way of doing it and more risk-free way of building these supply chains instead of playing the holding and waiting game, because that
Right.
becomes almost a gamble, and tomorrow you don't know if what's going to happen in the global markets, how India's policies or partners' policies keep on changing. So
Yeah.
Is there any room for like specific financial products in such cases, like future, in commodities generally you tend to have like futures contracts where you can lock in prices. I mean, this is way early, I guess, but is there something, a role that financial products or sophistication can play that you see?
so I think they obviously do have a place.
Yeah.
But then the question is, you've got to look at the lot sizes, right? So
Yeah.
if you really want to bring it down to a farmer level, and if you look at the largest commodities exchange in India is NCDX.
Mhm.
So NCDX generally deals in a lot size of 10 metric tons.
Mhm.
An average farmer would grow around, as in the farmer, at least the farmers we deal with, if you've got 2 hectares of land, your soybean production is going to be maybe anything between 1.8 to 2.4 metric tons.
Yeah.
So then you want 4
Fragmented.
farmers to then join hands and then buy a hedge or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just impossible, right? Because these
Yeah.
4 guys will never agree to what the selling point is.
Yeah.
So you still have to create a product which is lined up with an individual, as an individual can deal with. But then it becomes so fragmented that it becomes almost unexecutable, right? Because for you as an exchange to do transactions in lot sizes of 2 metric tons or fractions of or fractions is going to be almost an impossible task.
Yeah.
So
It seems like more like obviously when you look at a financial contract, I mean, it can be structured whatever way you want, but I think here the problem might be more of a basic supply chain sourcing in those kind of mapped or aligned with those kind of contracts in the first place. Like for instance, like in this case, like the base contract size itself is too big for, I would say, more than 50-60% of the farmers. I don't know.
But then you can't really do anything less, right? So the generally when you move these, so when you do a contract, the contract also has to be executed at some point of time.
Sure.
When you have to execute that contract, so if I'm a buyer who's buying that, as in who's going to offtake that produce, I would want to move that produce from wherever it is stored to my warehouse. I can only move it in lot sizes of 10 metric tons because that's generally the lowest truck size which is feasible for me to move it in. So if you as farmer, as in if I start getting into contracts which are fractions of this, it becomes almost an impossible task for me to move this produce in a cost effective manner.
Right.
So I really don't know what the answer to these things is, right?
Right.
But these are challenges which you will face in kind of creating specific financial products which kind of help farmers de-risk. Then there is always the fear that, okay, yes, we get into a forward contract with the farmer, which is done at the time of sowing itself, where you lock in a price, but what happens if the prices go above what the prices you've kind of committed, right? So there are so many unknowns. So you as a farmer had 2 hectares of land, you would generally grow 2 tons of soy on that. I am a buyer and you and I get into a contract where I say that, okay, I will buy 2 tons of soy from you at 50,000 rupees a metric ton.
Right.
But tomorrow if the prices go above 60,000, let's say, you as a farmer will default on that contract and I will have no recourse.
Right.
Because there are 2 things you can say. One is the weather conditions were not suitable and I kind of lost my entire crop. So sorry, sir, I really can't. And 2 is if I really want to go to the legal system and obviously I will not have a contract with one farmer, I will have a contract with thousands of farmers. I have to basically file thousands of lawsuits, which is just not productive. And in the reverse side, right, if the prices actually go below this, while I as a buyer could have bought this produce lower, now I'm stuck to this contract where I'll be forced to kind of be a part of it.
Right.
So I'm not saying that either one of them are wrong, but these contracts are just difficult to enforce. And
because I guess the logistics behind these contracts, there's a mismatch between those logistics and the actual supply side of things, right? Because that's what it kind of sounds like in terms of, like, it does make economic sense to look at 10 metric tons, right? But when the supply side is fragmented to start with, unless you have an intermediary, which obviously brings its own set of issues, then it's difficult to execute these contracts in the first place. I mean, especially when they're exercised, till they're like futures being traded, it's different, right? But when they actually get exercised,
no, you're absolutely right. So as in a lot of people have would term the traders or the different middlemen as evil beings, but they've provided a critical service to this entire industry, right? So they're
market makers.
They're market makers. If they did not exist, the poor farmer.
I mean, there's a reason why the institutional buyer doesn't want to go all the way to the granular farmer level, because his requirement is completely skewed based on what the produce is from there. And
Yeah.
so of course he needs an intermediary.
They need an intermediary.
Right.
They don't have the capability to kind of deal with the small lot sizes. They don't have the. Then there is always a set of regulations, right? So the regulations require that you make the payment to the farmer same day.
Right.
Any large buyer with all his processes will take at least 3 days. As in,
Yeah.
we've not come across a buyer.
Right.
The most efficient one of those, they take 3 days to process a payment.
Yeah.
Because you've got to go through a series of checks and balances before
Right.
that payments can be released.
Right.
In the case of a small farmer, while the quanta might be small, but you've got to execute so many of these payments
Right.
that a lot of these buyers just don't have the ability. So you work with people who have the ability to make cash payment or payments quickly to these farmers and move the produce upstream.
Well, I'll just ask a very blue sky question. It's you can completely pass over it because I don't even know where you'll start because agriculture overall is such a broad area. But you have obviously gone through this journey. You know what the pain points are. You have seen what the challenges are. If there was this one single biggest reform, something that the policymaker has to focus on, one thing, what do you think will be the most urgent priority for them?
I think the sector is still very heavily regulated.
Okay.
There are a lot of regulations which are applicable at different points. I think some of that needs to be gotten rid of. I am not saying that the mandi system, which requires a reference from an existing player, is good or bad.
Yeah.
It has its advantages, right? Because when this person vouches for you, he or she is also vouching that in case of a default of payments from you, they are going to pay it out of their pocket.
Yeah.
So there needs to be maybe a better system of managing that, where you can bring in more competent players into the system, where you open up the system to agencies which are not already related to existing players.
Right.
So that might bring in more neutrality into the system. The same applies when you're looking at imports. Again, you need a license to sell imports. You need a license to stock imports and the likes. Maybe it is required, right? Because there is the fear of spurious imports being thrown into the market.
Right.
But can you maybe regulate it better? Can we maybe bring in more transparency? Tech can play a role in a lot of these things.
Yeah.
You've got Aadhaar, which is linked to everything. You've now got GST, which is linking all movement of goods. Can all of it be combined together to create a system which is ensuring that there are no spurious inputs which enter the system? There are no farmers who are being left unpaid.
Right.
When they are being bought from buyers and when a buyer is purchasing from them. There can be more institutional players and there can be more transparent players doing the aggregation. The government's tried to do a lot of things. The government's tried to set up what is called as the Electronic National Agriculture Market, ENAM. I think there are flaws in the way it's been designed. I think it can never really just be an electronic market because this is physical products which need to be lifted. Every one of these lots is different. Every lot size is different. So there are just an infinite number of SKUs which need to be
just
handled.
If you have to give a brief explainer on this platform is supposed to be like a digital mandi. How does it work? What exactly is the...
So it was supposed to be that the idea, or it was basically supposed to be a kind of it was supposed to be an eBay kind of a setup, where a farmer could sell their produce directly to a buyer, right? So you've kind of list your product, and there are multiple buyers, and they will bid for it. Whoever is the highest buyer kind of then gets access to that produce. The problem is, one is there are too many of these lot sizes, right? So as a buyer, for me to bid on every one of those lot sizes, even if you do the entire quality check, is almost an impossible task, right? Because if I am a processor who's going to process 2,000 metric tons of a commodity a day, and an average lot size is around 1 metric ton, I need to make 2,000 bids on that day, and hope that every one of those bids will come through.
Otherwise my requirement won't be met.
Otherwise my requirement won't be met. If I overbid, I might actually be paying a higher price than everyone else's. So there are too many unknowns in this entire system. Then the other issue was the responsibility of moving the goods from wherever these bids have taken or wherever this produces to the buyer's location is now a buyer's responsibility. So which is not possible, right? So a buyer would, and this is where it gets interesting, right? So in the ideal world, I think, and again, I guess
they won't need the platform if they have the capability of moving it themselves, right?
That's why they hired had those traders or those brokers, right, to aggregate this produce, to make sure that the quality was there in place, to make sure that payments were being done. you make the payment over here to the farmer in advance. These buyers are used to making payments after 15 to 45 days. Now with the MSME Act, all of these guys are now being forced to make payments within 45 days. But in the good old days, those payments would get extended to 90 days.
Right.
And you would have to agree to those terms and conditions, because it's the buyer at the end of the day.
Right.
The buyer decides to pay you after 90 days, you take that. So as in, again, I don't know what the solutions to a lot of these problems are. Maybe lesser regulation, but then lesser regulation also comes with its own set of evils.
Right.
And there are cases, right? So there'll be people who will say that, okay, sell your produce to us, and overnight they will vanish. And there have been cases in Rajasthan, in MP, where we've seen people lose 2-3 crores worth of produce overnight. But then it is also very heavily regulated. So I don't know which is a worse.
But I guess, I mean, in this particular example that you mentioned, that where the onus is now put on the buyer, and the buyer is technically free to tap, as you said, in a modern globalized paradigm, the buyer is kind of free to tap other geographies, right?
Yeah.
But within that with that background, do you think the more protectionism is also something that needs to be looked at when it comes to agri as a space?
In terms of market linkages, or
no, in terms of just making it more difficult for buyers to source from overseas.
But you can't do that, right? You are part of a global economy, right? So if you start putting in trade,
agri protectionism is one of the most seminal contentious topics in countries in the West, right? I mean, even if you look at something like the US or Canada, I mean, they fight over dairy, they fight over maize. Like the US has a heavy corn lobby, so they don't want corn from Mexico coming in. I mean, it's something which even the most progressive regimes or countries. I said US and I said progressive. I don't know whether in the current context that's a fit. But anyways, I mean, you don't think that's the answer?
So there are two things.
Because it's an easy kill, right?
So it's an easy kill, but then you destroy the industry within the country, right? Because then you make your own industry uncompetitive. So tomorrow, if I have to buy starch, so you're just talking about the agro-processing industry, but the end product is what drives the price.
Yeah.
So if I'm a starch manufacturer, I need to be able to source produce at the right rate to be able to make money by selling starch.
Right.
Now, if I'm not able to do that, some companies seated in the US would be able to do that after building all the logistics costs and the other duties, and still be more price competitive than me. Anyways, I think our agricultural produce is more expensive than produce anywhere else in the world.
Okay.
So yeah. So
that's interesting.
So we pay more for our wheat, we pay more for our corn within India, as compared to the price which is paid for any of these commodities globally.
Right.
But we survive because it's a fairly large country with a lot of consumption. The supplies generally are either just able to manage our requirements or thereabouts. Right? So we can kind of still do that. I think there is still some level of protectionism which is built into it.
Right.
We are an oil deficit country. We don't allow the import of beans. We only allow import of oil, which keeps the prices of oil seeds fairly high in our country.
Right.
We are still a non-GM country in most ways, so there is a slight premium which gets built when we export our agricultural produce.
Right.
We don't consume imports as much as they are consumed in let's say China or the US. So again, maybe we handle the produce in a much worse way. Maybe we don't know how to use the right set of inputs, and that's why we have those pesticide residue issues. But otherwise, agriculture as such is not in a very bad state. If you look at it, right?
What are your views on MSPs and sort of that kind of regulatory frameworks?
So all of these were basically created to provide some kind of protection to the farmer against the variances which might come into the market.
Yeah.
So it's done well in terms of ensuring that we are a country which has enough wheat and paddy stock to take care of the people of our country. And I think while MSP is declared for a fairly large number of commodities, wheat and paddy are the two commodities where MSP is most predominant because the government actually steps in and buys. Over the last few years, we've seen entry into a few oilseeds, in some cases pulses where the government is also buying. We've seen that happen with Cotton Corporation of India buying cotton. But the government generally steps in when there is distress sale happening. The government also has its limitations in terms of what is the budget which is set aside for being able to buy these crops. it gives you some kind of protection as a farmer against. So when you have taken that decision to sow the seed, you don't know what price, and this is unfortunate, right? Whenever you set up a company, you know where your market is and at what price you'll be selling your produce, or at least have some idea. Yeah. You at least get to decide the price at which you want to sell your produce. Over here, there were no such systems, or the farmer did not really have that kind of facility. So it works well. Maybe it works well in the case of wheat and rice. Maybe it's also created a bias in favor of wheat and rice, which could have its implications in terms of climate change, because both of these are fairly intensive, both in terms of water as well as nutrition. Right. We've got enough stocks in our country. There's also been a change in eating habits because of this, right? So we were traditionally a millet eating country. We've now started becoming more of a wheat consuming country. So there has been a lot of impact of what these policies are. But they give fair returns to farmers. They get stable returns to farmers. These are also crops which are fairly sturdy, right? So they can withstand heavy rains. They can withstand heavy winds. They can also withstand spells of drought. Right. So these are good crops on that front. They'll still give you some productivity, but they obviously killed the market for some of the other crops.
But if you mentioned that thanks to MSP, especially in these two crops, it actually generates fair returns. Now, when you read the popular narrative on agriculture, we keep on hearing of the distressed farmer. That's something which has only gone up in terms of the noise that it's creating. And obviously there have been instances where there have been farmers who have actually come to big cities and demonstrated their anguish. Some of them is real, some of them is also, they say it's politically motivated. It's a fairly complex issue to actually pinpoint how it's panning out. But what is your view on the condition of the average Indian farmer down the years, like say in the past half a decade? Are you more optimistic, or are you kind of cynical? You think a lot of things have to be worked out, because in terms of from a consumption standpoint, the country is also changing, right, rapidly, and that obviously has an impact all the way. So what are your overall thoughts on it?
See, I think the biggest challenge, even when we had started Gram Unnati, was the dependency of a farmer to take the decision in terms of what they are going to plant on the price which they got last year, and maybe some kind of assurance of the market which is available, right? So in an area which might have and which is very interesting in case of, let's say, a sugarcane farmer. There are sugarcane farmers who haven't been paid in the last 3 years, but they continue to grow sugarcane because there is at least an assurance of a market. So that when you sell cane, you will get the rate which has been fixed, and there is a buyer who will be there. Whether the buyer pays you after 3 years or 5 years or the same year is at times questionable. This kind of assurance from the market is lacking, right? So what happens is when there was a period maybe 4 years, 5 years back when the pulses prices shot through the roof, and we were buying pulses at 200 rupees a kg or whatever. It happens almost every second year in case of potatoes and onions, where the prices of onions and potatoes go through the roof. What that does is every time there is the prices go through the roof in a certain commodity, next year people have a tendency to shift to that cropping pattern. So if you find that the prices of chickpea or tuar dal or any of the pulses have gone through, next year a lot of farmers will start growing it, because last year people who did it made a killing, or last year if they had done it at a limited scale.
But the price hike in case of potatoes, onions, that's a supply shock, or that's a...
So it's cyclical, right? So it happens everywhere, in every commodity, and it's most interestingly in potatoes and onions because it's almost a regular biannual feature. Right? So you will see that this year, if there is a shortage of potatoes and onions, the prices will go up. Because of which next year a lot of farmers will start planting potatoes and onions, because of which the supply that year is going to be more and the prices will crash. And because the prices have crashed, the year after these farmers will not grow potatoes and onions, and because there will be a lesser availability of the products, the prices will start going up again. It's almost cyclical.
No, but the supply shock is not because of hoarding. The supply shock you're saying is because of...
It could be. So, see, you really can't hoard onions and potatoes over a very long duration. Right. You can maybe hoard pulses, you can maybe hoard some of these other commodities, but while you have those momentary 1 month, 2 month period, but over a longer duration, you really can't, because they start deteriorating, right? So these are still fairly perishable commodities. Not as perishable as the green vegetables and the likes, but they are still fairly perishable. So, and there is a lot of carrying cost which is built into it. So carrying a kg of potatoes is more expensive than carrying a kg of, or like basically storing a kg of potatoes over a 1 month period is much more expensive than storing 1 kg of maize or 1 kg of something else.
Right.
Because you need cold stores, you need to kind of maintain the right kind of ambient temperature and humidity to make sure that happens. So these shocks are not there because of, so while I'm sure the hoarders play a role, they help you to kind of drive up the prices from, let's say, 80 to 120.
Yeah.
But the reason why prices are 80 is because there was a supply shortage. And that is where maybe the government can then start playing a role, because as an individual farmer, I don't have the ability to understand what every other farmer is planting.
Right.
But maybe the government has the ability to see what the planting patterns are.
Right.
You've got your own seed companies. There's the National Seed Corporation, and there are the state seed corporations. You've got some level of control or some level of oversight on the private seed companies and the likes.
Right.
If all you have to do is kind of start understanding where are these trends going, and if people are now planting crops in areas where they traditionally haven't been planting those crops, you need to start taking a call. At least release an advisory, and at least that people know that okay, there are a lot more farmers who are doing this. There might be a price shock, as in there might be a crash which is around the corner when your produce.
So you might want to diversify.
You might want to diversify, or you might want to just look at doesn't not grow at all, right? So in this case, not growing might actually be a better option than growing this and selling it at a price where you don't even get the cost of transportation recovered at times.
Right. Yeah.
And that, I think, is what happens, right? So when situations like these come in, where you've got overproduction of tomatoes or overproduction of potatoes and onions, and those are generally the commodities which get thrown on the streets of the urban centers where people might be noticing. So while I'm sure there's a lot of politics behind it, but it is driven by the fact that the prices were low.
But I think in between you mentioned, also the entire issue of wheat and rice being climate intensive, and obviously they have climate implications as well. I mean, I wanted to obviously talk about Odisha, because that is something that is a place where you are actively involved in from a work perspective, and from a climate perspective, you must have seen what's going on there. And I think Odisha is obviously one example. I think in the last 12 to 14 months, other states as well. I mean, it's partly man-made, partly natural. Be it Assam, be it Kerala, we kind of see these impacts coming. And this year is supposed to be lighter on monsoons as well. So I'm guessing that will also have an implication. But like, what's going on there in terms of and from a man-made factor perspective, what do you think are the biggest drivers?
So I'm not an expert on climate change per se, right? But what we do see is the impact of climate change on people we work with, people we work with closely. Fani pretty much destroyed the entire standing crop in 3 or 4 districts of Odisha. When I say standing crop, they did not really have paddy plantations on the ground, but almost 6,000-7,000 hectares of coconut plantations were lost. You lost a fairly large quantity of mango and cashew plantations which are there in that area. I don't think there is a lot which can be done in terms of controlling these disasters, right? What you can do is plan so that you are de-risked. You can't stop these from happening, but maybe you can prepare for those. What we've been doing, and what as an institution, and which maybe is also driven by the fact that because we work so closely with the industry, and we now have a buyer portfolio kind of covering the entire gamut of agricultural products, we now are engaging with the farmers we work with, and we're trying to kind of push 2 agendas. One is that if they are growing a certain kind of crop, they should try grow multiple kinds, as in multiple varieties of that crop, because you don't know whether a drought is around the corner or heavy rains are around the corner.
Hedge yourself, basically.
So hedge yourself. If you are very clear that this is the product you want to grow, make sure that the harvesting times are also different. Also, then start getting into what is called as mixed cropping, right? So don't just limit yourself to a particular crop, which is called monocropping, but grow maybe other kinds of field crops, maybe have some horticultural crops, maybe some vegetables, have some plantation crops. See if you can do something around a poultry or a dairy and the mix. So kind of create the right mix, which helps an individual hedge against climate change, also hedge against price variations, And in a way, it also takes care of two other things, right? Labor is now becoming more of an issue in the sector.
Right.
So while the landholdings are small, you don't really have manpower, and unfortunately for a country like ours, you still don't have manpower which is ready to work in the fields. So if you kind of try out different varieties, or if there are varieties which are growing at or harvesting at different times, your labor requirement at a certain point of time gets reduced, and you can kind of reduce your entire overhead which is associated with this. The other is the instances of pest attack also go down as you start getting into different crops. If it were all just one kind of a crop which you are growing in an area, it would be very easy for a pest to move from one field to the other. But now, because you are growing different kinds, it maybe helps you reduce your entire cost of cultivation. So that's what we've been pushing for, and I think
This
a lot
is
of
some sort of a state-driven dissemination program through which it's going on.
no, we do it, and we do it mostly because we as a business don't make money if the farmer doesn't produce. So for us, it is important that the farmer produces at least something for us to make money in the process. So it's important for us to ensure that the farmer has something at the end of the day, so that their and our relationship can continue, and we can kind of work with the buyers we are working with. I think there are state governments which are talking about it, but then it becomes very difficult, right? So how does a farmer choose which crop to grow? There might be 5 different crops which are suitable for that, but there is no assurance that I'll find a market for it. The reason why I have traditionally grown wheat or rice is because the government buys that.
Yeah.
Or there is, if I grow maize in a certain pocket, is because there are buyers for that. What if I start growing some kind of a millet or some kind of a pulse in those areas, and there is no buyer for that? So our ability is to kind of bring in that market. And all of what we do kind of starts from that you make sure that there is a market available for whatever you produce, and then you start dictating that, okay, let's try out different mixes, see what works for you best. And then over time, this process will fine tune, people will start figuring out, okay, this is the right mix, and then maybe that will become the cropping habit.
So like how in terms of convincing or pitching this particular methodology, is it a function of, look, last year these guys did it, it showed better results? Is that how you convince at the ground level?
So generally,
do you find them conducive to actually external advice, for the lack of a better word?
So the thing is, they generally believe what they see. So if there is someone who's done it in their locality or in their vicinity, or if there's someone they've heard of who's done it, they'd be open to trying it out.
Right.
Generally, whenever we also start, we don't dictate that, okay, you try it on 100% of your land. We said, okay, it's a new technique, let's try it out on 5% of your land or 10% of your land. Right. Even if you don't get anything out of it, you know that there is an alternative and you can fall back on the 90% of your land. That's generally the starting point. It is now a matter of trust, right? So at the end of the day, if we've been with that group of farmers for the last 2-3 years, and we've been kind of engaging with them to ensure that whatever they have grown, there is a buyer for it who's ready to pay a fair price for their produce. It builds that element of trust, and they start working with you closely to then start improving their production practices, changing the varieties, changing the inputs which they've been putting in, and which helps you unlock value. So it's a matter of time actually. With us, we obviously do work closely with the government, and we've been very blessed in working and having great supporters within the government,
right,
who've kind of helped us mobilize farmers, helped us make sure that our message is well understood by these farmers. While when they do sign off, we want to still make sure that they are not signing off on the entire piece of their land, right? Sure. Because if tomorrow if there was a mistake at our end, right, and like I said, we might be experts or we might be working with experts, weather or climate is something which is not in our hand. Right. So you really want to make sure that it's still the farmer's decision, but you want to push them in the right direction by ensuring that whatever they are doing will find a fair market for, which will kind of put in some money into their pocket.
Yeah.
And then over time, maybe things will start happening. So it started happening in states like Rajasthan, where we've been around for a while, to some extent in parts of MP. Odisha has been a great experience, mostly because of the way the government's been proactive in working with us. So I must confess that Odisha was a state which we really thought was a really poor state where agriculture should not have been one of those things. Intuitively, you believe Odisha is where the mines are and the cyclones are, right? So, but it's been a the administration is fairly progressive. They go out of the way. The same happened in Uttarakhand, where they've been pushing for shifting farmers away from summer paddy to crops which require lesser water, and those have started giving the results. So the initial, why weren't farmers doing it initially? Because they did not have a buyer for it. Now we've kind of run a program where we're working with a buyer, and the government is kind of pushing it. So the farmers now see that okay, their returns are actually much better than what they were when they were growing paddy. And in terms of revenue numbers also, not just in terms of income, but in terms of revenue numbers, they are making more money. So it then starts incentivizing people that okay, there is a buyer who's going to pay me well enough. Why don't I try this thing? So I'll still hedge my bets. I'll grow some paddy. I'll grow some maize, but at least some portion of your field is now shifted to maize, which doesn't require as much water. Similarly, in Odisha, we're trying to kind of see what can you do around the coconut supplies in the coconut industry to create systems which are able to withstand cyclones. And hopefully some of those ideas will work.
So it's a matter of like, you iterate, then there is some precedent which is set, you see a proof of concept. I mean, as you said, they are entrepreneurs, right? So they're going to do it like that. But I mean, speaking of like directions, I think we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to touch upon this last point because Aneesh was so excited about it in the beginning. The budget 2019 and how significant it has been for the agricultural sector. Obviously, I hope the sarcasm comes out. There was one reference to zero budget farming. I kind of understand that's not a very recent concept. It has been around for some time. Okay, what exactly is it and why the push towards it?
So there is the concept is called zero budget natural farming, ZBNF, which was which basically is like how things have grown in the wild, right? So let's get back to growing things the way they were done, and the push for that I think is on two fronts. One is there's a fairly large fertilizer and input subsidy which is given by the government, which is taxing on the exchequer. The second, which is what I would like to believe is the reason why they're doing it, is the overuse of some of these inputs has actually spoiled our some soils in some parts beyond repair. Because the soil has a lot of nutrients in it, and carbon is one of the most important ones for those. Right? Without carbon, you can't really get a lot of vegetative growth. So over the years, because of excessive use of pesticides, primarily because of excessive use of fertilizers, and not just excessive but also indiscriminate, right? So where it wasn't required, you added 2 or 3 times the quantities which were, and those kind of fertilizers have now become a part of the soil itself. So you've kind of killed the soil's natural ability to nourish a plant. So ZBNF is a way to replenish these dead soils and bring in the microorganisms which will then start helping convert the nutrients which exist in these soils and start supplying it to the plant. The plant cannot just absorb nutrients.
So what is the zero budget here?
So zero budget was because this is how nature had worked, right? So in the forest, the entire concept is in the forest you don't really need to plant a tree, or if you plant a tree you don't really need to go and water it.
There's no maintenance budget required.
So there were and the reason why they could do it was because there were microorganisms and natural. So there were natural pesticides which existed, right? So if there is a pest, there would be, let's say, a ladybug which will go kill it, or a praying mantis which will go kill a pest, right? So these natural defense mechanisms existed in the forest.
But it comes in the expense of efficiency and output productivity, I guess.
So that's the point, right? So we've got a fairly large population to feed. We need to be efficient in terms of our ability to grow enough food for the population. It needs to be of a certain quality. So when you suddenly shift to a zero budget natural farming, it's almost like going back to the days where we did not have enough food in the country. And we are now a fairly large country, as in we are a much larger country than what we were back in the day, which led to the Green Revolution. So again, I really don't know what is right, but there is now a new market which is developing for people who are more conscious about the environment and who are conscious about the sustainability of agriculture, and they are slowly shifting to zero budget natural farming. There will always be a fairly large group of people in the country who would need food to be served to them at a low cost. I don't think will be able to afford ZBNF as of now, but I think over time there would have to be a good mix of what we've been doing in the past, correcting that by introducing something like introducing elements of ZBNF, but maybe we
This
don't.
this does not sound like a mass market idea.
So
You are not convinced, obviously.
So as of now, right, the productivity levels are lower.
Yeah.
The quality of the produce which comes in terms of say shape and size is not going to be there, because in nature things weren't really always perfect, right? So when you grow a certain,
It sounds like a nice to have plan, not a need to have plan.
Yeah. So maybe over time things will change.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll find a way to grow enough food using ZBNF. As of now, we are still in the transition stage. The jury is still out. For us, there is a group of buyers who requires produce which was grown ZBNF in the ZBNF format, and they are willing to pay a premium for it.
Can't market?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so that crowd. So there and
Actually, like last, I think 5 or 6 episodes, we have always just, whenever the guest is saying, I just say Khan market or Valmiki market in the background, hoping for it to stick in some context or the other. This one,
today is your lucky day.
seems to stick. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a market, and
Right.
it obviously is remunerative for those people because they get a price premium, even
Yeah.
though there is a lesser, as in the production is lower.
Yeah.
But how much of that market exists, or what will be the premium over time as this scale of this operation grows, only time will tell.
Right.
As of now, we continue to push people to grow whatever the market is willing to pay for.
Very price action, market oriented view.
Yeah.
This is something that me and Sharad, we thoroughly enjoy. in
Yeah,
general.
and especially when it comes in the field of agriculture, it's even more amusing. So, love the conversation.
I mean, because nobody talks about agriculture in these ways.
Okay.
People generally
Yeah.
like it always has a very kind of a not for profit kind of a mindset.
Yeah.
When most people are talking about it. So it's a kind of refreshing to hear a more
Free market focused.
free market or market oriented view, which
Thank
is probably the only way it can work. No, thanks a lot, Anish. I think it's been great fun, and now it's 1 hour 2 minutes. So I think we have
Time has really flown.
Time has really flown. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as well. The green tea was already consumed before the podcast started, so that kind of went offline in any case.
Yeah.
And on that note, would like to call this a day. Would obviously welcome all our listeners to put in your comments on this particular episode. Tell us where we are going right and where we are going wrong. We'll try to improve things as we go. And this is Nikhil Arora
This is Sharad Tupran.
signing off.